Welcome. You tuned in to Salam Media with myself, Salalo Makwidira. The time is 18 minutes past 2, and I will be shifting our focus, I think, on a very, very important event that took place almost 2 decades ago. On September 11th, 2001, the world watched in shock as one of the most devastating terrorist attacks in history unfolded. The events of that day forever changed not only the United States, but also the whole world and the global landscape. 2 decades later, we continue to see the ripple effects of 9/11 in international politics, security, and societal attitudes. We Today, I'm going to be joined by Roscoe Palm, an IRL columnist and investigative journalist, just to reflect on how the world has transformed since that fateful day on September 11th. We'll be exploring the political, social, and psychological consequences of 9/11 and also discuss its lasting impact on global relations. Roscoe, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Salam Media. Glad you could join us today.
Thank you for having me, Salelo. It's good to be here and good day to your audience.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's been 20 years since the 9/11 attacks. In your view, what are some of the most significant ways that 9/11 has reshaped global politics and security policies generally?
Well, as you say, it's been a generation and 22 years since the 9/11 event. And in general, 9/11 led to a more aggressive interventionist US foreign policy, much of which persists to this day. 9/11 centered US geopolitical conflict to combating what it defines as global terrorism. And it had long term consequences throughout the world for global diplomacy, US relations with the Middle East. And I think, in a way, it turned the page on the enormous cultural influence that the US had in the 90s. I think when the Berlin Wall fell, it was termed to be the end of history, that the US liberalism had won. So the US operated in almost a vacuum of geopolitical competition. So then in 2001, when 9/11 happened, I think it really was the start of the decline in the prestige of the US imperial project, as I think many commentators term it.
And I think one of the key and most important ways that the United States of America responded to 9/11 is with what they coined the war on terror. And this included, I think, most notably the invasion of Afghanistan and also the invasion of Iraq. Just assessing those two interventions from the US. Long term, what can we say are some of those long term impacts that these military interventions on the Middle East have had, particularly looking at that part of the world, specifically the Middle East, and the relationship that the US has had with them?
I think from the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, we have to be conscious of the fact that the US did not invade Afghanistan alone. Up until 2001, through the 90s, the NATO existed to defeat the Cold War powers. So therefore, it had no real, I would say, uh, credibility or life as a security bloc. Of course, it was involved in the conflicts in the Balkan regions. But when the US invoked Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which says that an attack on the US is an attack on all of us, and in so doing it allowed itself to enlist European countries in its so-called war on terror. Of course, it has lost its credibility, as you point out, in the invasion of Iraq, which it used the flimsy premise of searching for weapons of mass destruction, which were then never found. That period also gave birth to institutes such as the Department of Homeland Security and the Patriot Act, which is still being used today. And I think in especially a security-cratic world, to now monitor digital communications. So we can definitely say that 9/11, again, it led to a more interventionist US, particularly in the Middle East at that time. But we've also seen that machinery tilt to other theaters now. It has to counter China in the Pacific Rim. It has to counter also Russian activity in Eastern Europe. And it's also important to note that the language that it uses now and the means that it uses to counter these threats have their origin in September 11 and the bureaucratic and security military industrial machinery that emerged from that day.
And I think it's so easy sometimes to try and make 9/11 be something that's very very political, without forgetting that in the years following the attacks, we saw a rise in Islamophobia and suspicion towards Muslim communities. How do you think this cultural and societal shift has affected global perceptions on the Muslim world, and also interfaith relations?
It's had an absolutely fundamental and I would say very difficult to reverse trend, effect on Islamophobia. Immediately after the September 11th incident, there was many false rumors that were spread about another bomb and Muslims celebrating as the towers fell. Similarly, after the October 7th incident in Israel, there were also myths that were propagated through official channels as high as the President of the United States, where they platformed false information meant to horrify of sexual assault and babies being beheaded and such like. And also, I mean, we see the rise of such disinformation that result in long-standing discrimination against Muslim people. The banning on the burqa in places like France and places like Canada, discrimination against anyone that Western liberals deem to be other. I would say that it also, that moment gave rise to many intellectuals like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, and these people who are masquerade as intellectuals but are straight up Islamophobes, and their cultural sway over a particular Western, I would say, it's not inclusively multiculturalist. It's something that excludes others, mainly brown people, mainly Muslim people, mainly the others that do not fit into effectively what is a continuation of colonialism, racism, and white supremacy.
Mm. Would we be reaching, if we assumed that the way the United States right now is reacting to, the Palestine issue and the ongoing genocide perpetuated by the Israeli occupying forces, is in a way linked with what happened on September 11th, 2001?
Well, I think it's the continuation of US foreign policy that I think 9/11 was very much kick-started. We see that there's almost unconditional, unequivocal support of Israel, despite there being a plausible genocide. We see within the liberal institutions when the UK suspended 30 of hundreds of arms licenses to Israel, what the impact was, or rather the backlash was from mainly pro-Zionist interest groups. So, in as much as the state of Israel is allowed to perpetuate the impunity that it practices over the Palestinian people, being a client state of the US, it is able to do that. And I believe that when you are a friend of the United States, as we saw in the subsequent war on terror after September 11th, people who would be, had Tony Blair been an African person or a leader of an Arab country not in favor of the United States, he would have been hauled before the International Criminal Court or the Court of Justice. So the international rules-based order, I think, where there was once a reverence for that, or rather an aspiration to be part of that, has now been completely dissolved to a state where we realize that the US and any superpower serves its own interests,
mm,
that it can no longer, it's where other countries had been, I think, on the face of it, wanting to join the United States in what it termed to be a war of terror. Now we understand, these countries understand that it's purely transactional.
mm,
It's you are a friend of the United States, and you accrue certain benefits, certain standing, certain favor, and the illusion of the rules-based order. Certainly, I think September 11th was the moment where we all started waking up from that particular delusion.
mm, mm, mm. And we often hear about the economic cost of the war on terror and the rise of groups like ISIS in the wake of U.S. interventions in these various countries. How has the post 9/11 era influenced exactly that, the rise of extremism in different parts of the world?
Well, extremism doesn't arise out of nowhere. Even to pretend that Al Qaeda or the groups that were the targets of the US post 9/11, the Islamist groups, they didn't appear out of nowhere. It's well documented that Osama bin Laden is funding, and he was being a beneficiary of largesse from the United States as they fought their war against Russia in Afghanistan. Similarly, we find, whatever the objections to Hamas are, we understand, it's well documented that Benjamin Netanyahu had boasted about funding and facilitating Hamas according to his particular interests and agendas at the time.
Mm,
So, we can be under no illusion about the fact that 9/11 rather wasn't how the moment that America changed. It was that the mask of imperialism uh, got uh, got dropped from the face of US military power,
mm,
and it has irrevocably shifted diplomatic and international relations.
mm.
And we will still continue to deal with the consequence of that well into the future.
No, definitely. And just lastly, before I let you go, as we look ahead, how should the lessons of 9/11 inform current international cooperation efforts, especially in light of new threats, like climate change, cyber terrorism is a new thing, and also just the rise of authoritarian leadership, in some parts of the world.
Well, again, of course, who defines what is authoritarian? Who defines who is an enemy and who is a terrorist and who is um, a bad actor and a good actor? I
Mm,
think that if we look at things in terms of black and white and without historical context, we really are then just like football fans, cheering for our team and accepting things uncritically. There are certainly global threats, but the lens through which we must assess these threats should be the interests of superpowers. What is we understand that there are attempts to interfere within the polities of sovereign countries, African countries, wherever they may be, by geopolitical actors. Its media is a contested space, even to the point of communications and elections are, in fact, increasingly contested spaces.
mm,
Uh, so I would say that, as the we can see this consensus of blind faith in establishment media, establishment institutional authorities break down. But I think in that space we must be very cautious about what we accept to be true, what we don't accept to be true. We see certain institutions still holding firm against misinformation and disinformation and to counter authoritarianism. For example, the International Court of Justice, despite there being attempts to interfere in the processes. And now we see a lot of soft power influence being directed to get South Africa to drop our case at the ICJ. I still think that it's important that we have faith in, I think, those institutions, because if institutions that have hold authority over even superpowers break down, then what chance do we have in our capacity as individuals, in our groups, in our communities?
All right, we're going to leave it there. Roscoe Palm, IOL columnist and investigative journalist. Thank you so much for giving us your time and for your wonderful insight. Thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Oh, there you have it. 23 years since 9/11. The world is definitely a different place. And I think, as Roscoe mentioned there, that we'll be feeling the effects thereof for quite a while. I think, we're seeing with how the US is reacting to Palestine. It is definitely linked, with 9/11 and how they deemed that a part of their history, and how they'll be reacting to everything that resembles anything that looks like that. But we have come to the end of the show. Thank you so much for chatting to us. If you have missed this conversation and many others that we've had here on Salam Media, you can check them out on our website. All of the podcasts are there, and also wonderful articles written by our online team. But from myself, Salah, and the team, it's goodbye.